How's it going, everyone? In today's video we're going to be diving into a sound that I've been using a lot lately, which I often refer to as Synthy, Arps and textures. I've mentioned these in a few past videos, but I thought I would do this tutorial basically giving you a complete overview into this sound and how to creatively integrate them into your tracks. In this video we're going to be covering my top plugins for these sounds, how to write MIDI patterns with varying levels of complexity, and the best effects and processing techniques to make these sequences more unique. Let's get started. Before we get into the sound design, I'll just quickly start by introducing the sound. What this sound is, that I often refer to as Synthy, Arps and textures, is basically just sequenced sounds. Most of them come directly from plugins, and you'll often find these labeled under different categories. So Arps is one, sequences is another one, and rhythmic. There's a broad variety of these sequences, and we'll hopefully get into a few examples of them. When it comes to the actual sound, the main place I often start is with plugins. So what we'll do in this section is essentially cover some of my favorites. I'll give a few suggestions and basically let you dig from there. The first plugin you'll often hear me talk about is this one called Bluetooth. What I mainly look at is the ARP banks and the sequence sounds. What I'll do is I'll literally just hold one note and flick through presets. So essentially these sequences are really powerful ways to build inspiration and quickly get ideas. Typically, if I'm lacking inspiration or I want a quick way to add some energy, I'll go to these sequences and just see if something fits. So this is Bluetooth, which is typically one of my go-tos. This plugin actually comes from a company called Papen. Although I'm recommending individual plugins, I'll also give the name of the company because a lot of these will also have sequence sounds. From memory, the SubBoomBass one is quite good because it's got these really bassy sequences. I think a lot of these sequences can also be very hectic, so I'd very much advise trying to get a bit more creative and maybe resample and chop up the audio, isolate certain hits. You'll see there's so many nice noises in there and sounds that have potential. The second recommendation I would have is going to be Diva. We've got a few pretty nice ones there. Maybe if I type in sequence, if I type in ARP. So Diva doesn't have as many in the rhythmic category, but if you get creative with your search terms, typing in ARP, sequence or rhythmic up there, I'm sure you'd find tons of gold. The next collection I'll recommend is the Arturia ones. I think the majority of the Arturia ones have built-in sequences. If you're not familiar, the Analog Lab is basically all the plugins in one interface. So what I could do is I could go sequence, and you've literally got all these different presets from the different individual plugins. You'll see something that's quite nice about the Analog Lab interface is it will actually tell you the type of sequence. So if you want something a bit more rhythmic, you could go for this. If you want something a bit more melodically interesting. If you wanted some SFX. My fourth suggestion would be Spectrasonics. You've got plugins like Trillian and Omnisphere. So in Trillian, for example, you get ARP and BPM. This one has loads of really nice sounds. It's kind of more focused on bass sounds, but you'll hear there's a lot of these synth textures in there, and Omnisphere is just very similar. My final plugin suggestion is actually just Ableton. If we just repeat the exercise of searching one of those terms, I could search rhythmic, and I think it was in here, I found one of these, and this actually formed this layer below, which sounded like this. The thing that made this quite nice was it basically utilized the sampler in a way that created this rhythmic sequence in itself. So if I just play the note, you'll see it's basically starting with that sound and it's looping that section in a way that makes it sound like a sequence. So that is pretty much where I'd begin my search, is literally just with those plugins, looking for those sequenced presets. Now that we've seen how these presets work and how good they can be as starting points of inspiration, I'm sure there'll be many of you that's sat there thinking, using an inbuilt sequence isn't very creative, or isn't this just the same as using a melodic loop? I definitely agree to some extent that using inbuilt sequences isn't the most original of approaches, so in this section I want to introduce some ways of working with these inbuilt patterns in more creative ways. When it comes to the MIDI, I typically find that these patterns have 3 levels of complexity. The first level is the basic approach where you hold one note, which is typically the root note, and you just let it play the inbuilt sequence. I'll essentially use this basic approach if I want to addition the sounds, but there will also be times in a track where I might just want to utilize the sequences as ear candy fill type sounds. So I basically just used a really short note which only played some of the sequence. Play with the track. The second approach is recycling patterns. What you can do to take it that bit further is you can drop patterns from different layers in. So basically this pad layer here, what I could do is I could drop that up into this Arp sound, which will naturally play a sequence when I just play one note. So just by changing the MIDI, you're introducing another level of variance. So what we can basically do is we can recycle existing MIDI from other elements, typically playing a more melodic role, and we can basically give the sequence some direction, because if I just play this, the only direction we're really giving it is the root note, but if I was to hold 2 notes, 3 notes, we're giving it a lot more direction. So that's the second approach. And then the third approach, the final thing I've done is I've taken the organ layer from up here, I've moved it down, and basically what I've done is I've taken the top line of that pattern and shifted it to the right 2, which basically creates this RP sequence in itself. That's pretty much how I'd approach the MIDI writing process on 3 levels of complexity. The very last place we'll quickly touch on is going to be the effects and processing. When it comes to effects and processing, this is always going to be something with a lot of variation, but what I'll do is I'll quickly run through some basic effects chains and more creative ways to process these sequences. The first place I normally start is with the EQ. We will have the reverbs and delay, basically to create a sense of depth and movement. Often I'll have some form of modulation, so I'll normally use a phaser, but there's not really any set rules. And then the other effect I use is just a filter to filter the sound down. Often I'll add a bit of filter modulation to help the sound evolve. So EQ, reverb, delay, some form of modulation, and filtering would be my very basic beginning to this. Depending on how intense the loop is, you could also get creative with gating to basically chop it up and manipulate it in certain ways. What I'll actually do is I'll go to this and I'll show you a quick trick I like to use. What we've done for these layers is we've used them as SFX type textures. I've got these really raw sounds. And what I've basically done is this gating trick A few of you watching might be familiar with Tantra as this multi-effects plugin, but there's another way you can use it, and it's essentially as a gate. I've basically got this preset, and what I do is I bump the tremolo up to 100, and then you would go down to this gate and you would gradually bring it down, and it basically creates a handskate style effect. What I've also done here is more creative filtering. I think a big part of making these sequences more unique and more your own is purely just automation. So this is a very simple example where we've taken a bandpass and we're essentially just sweeping through. Alright people, that's going to wrap this one up. Hopefully you now have a solid foundation for incorporating these sounds into your tracks and creating some truly unique synth layers. If you found this one helpful, then definitely be sure to drop a like, hit subscribe, and let me know in the comments if you have any questions or future video requests. If you want to dive deeper into this sound, I'll be leaving a couple of related videos on screen. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again in the next one.